some professional models, and they using body paint and everything, did tests, and he rigged up a little device where the model would stand there, and it would drop her 1.5 inches, just with a little trap switch, and you could, in slow motion, filming at high speed, you could see that shockwave go right at the body and see the deformation of the breast tissue that looks exactly like what you see on the Patterson film. Just demonstrating that it's much more reasonable explanation that this is real tissue, real adipose tissue. There was also, I'm just about to publish in the RHI an article that he and I co-authored. He is the principal author, but it addresses not the musculature, but the adipose tissue, the skin and an underlying layer of fatty tissue. There are lots of funny-looking creases and lines and dimples that a lot of people have described. Things that to some eyes suggest shoulder pads on the shoulders and all. They argue that these features aren't natural. They don't appear on human bodies, and therefore they're some artifact of a costume. One of the hypotheses is the costume is a full body outfit that fits over a pair of trousers. So you'd have the trousers at first, and then kind of like those sleepers for kids that wrap down around and almost like a bathing suit. And that's why there's this funny line right across here. Well, all Bill had to do was simply go to the internet and go to internet sites of naturists, resorts where people have little inhibition and walk around with no clothing on. And people who aren't concerned really about that they aren't airbrushed and liposucked and artificially enhanced. And it was no challenge whatsoever to find clear examples of every crease, every dimple, every bit of cellulite, every bulge and so forth that was visible on Patty. The sags of skin on either side symmetrically underneath her shoulder blades that we more elderly people start to get, where the elasticity gets lost and more fatty tissue. Those don't occur. In order to introduce those into a costume, and we showed contradictory examples of a fur cloth costume, that a wrinkle like that would go all the way across the body from one side to the other. There's no way you can get them like this unless you stitch them in. You have to tailor those in specifically. And his point is, nobody in this industry, that's so much work, and people aren't going to otherwise take notice of that. No one would go to the trouble to do that. So an interesting three-pronged approach. I'm just working on a proposal that the bill has suggested that we continue to collaborate on to do a, quote, virtual dissection, where we're going to go now deeper and establish very clearly the joint centers on the limb segments and the comparative aspects of the underlying musculature, establish the skeletal proportions and the kinematics of the movement, quantify that, and then he wants to use comparative experimental methods to try to establish the underlying cranial anatomy. And with his expertise in building up from a hominid fossil skull what the hominid looked like, we'll do that in reverse and come up with a facsimile of what Patty's skull looked like. Do that to scale on that. I think that'll provide some really interesting insights. That's fascinating to me because I had independently, I was gratified to learn after I did it that Bill had done something very, very similar. I was struck by the similarities in cranial and facial proportions, and I took a side view of a Paranthropus skull, robust Australopithecine, which were early hominid offshoots of the ancestral human tree that adapted in a direction of much greater robusticity of the facial skeleton. Very deep, thick, heavy jaws, and tremendously enlarged molars and premolars. Also, much shorter canines. This is an interesting aspect of convergence here, possibly, if not inheritance of a trait. The shorter canines that wear tip to tip mean that the upper and lower jaws don't interlock when those canines overlap, which limit chewing to opening and closing. When you get rid of those long canines, now the teeth can do this. They can grind as well as crush. And those primates that have adapted to chewing like that, like Paranthropus and Gigantopithecus, with their excessively hypertrophied jaws and teeth, have also reduced their canines. Now it's interesting that all the representations by the Native Americans, say in the Northwest, and eyewitness descriptions, the vast majority of the credible reports note when they see the teeth that there are no big canines. The Puqua's mask, for example, has even rows of teeth that occlude flatly across the occlusal plane without those interlocking canines. So I put that robust Australopithecus skull next to an enlargement of the Patterson-Gimlin film subject, and all of the landmarks that denote the proportions from the top of the head to the brow, to the orbits, to the nasal aperture, the teeth, the chin, the big flaring gonial here for those massive masseter muscles. I can't say it. Massive masseter muscles, those muscles here in the cheeks, that are so big that they're casting a shadow across the front of her face right here. They're massive. All those features line up point for point, which is just amazing. Now you think about it, 1967, what might have been the inspiration for the Patterson film? What giant primate was known to the public?
King Kong.
King Kong. And it's based on a gorilla with a jutting face and big canine teeth. And instead, we have a creature that exhibits exactly the kinds of dental adaptations that you would expect for a creature, a primate, a large omnivorous primate inhabiting the forests of North America, where it's not eating soft figs as one of its primary food items. It's eating very coarse items, roots and lichen and meat and so forth. So that's the next step with the Patterson film. So yes, the Patterson film is, you know, it still stands as the most compelling photographic evidence. And I think by the time we're done and have published our results, the burden will be on the naysayers. It'll be, I think, a conclusive demonstration that this is, in fact, a photographic representation of an absolutely real creature. All right, Snellgrove Lake. Snellgrove Lake, we flew up to north kind of west central, well, I guess west central Ontario, and 2.5-hour float plane flight into this remote fishing cabin. Really the only access into it. I mean, I was saying, you've got a lot of lakes here, but when you're flying over that area, you look down and it's 50-50 land and water. It's like a jigsaw puzzle scattered out on the table. You couldn't go more than maybe 1.5 miles in a straight line anywhere because there's just so much water. And what is there is very, very rugged, broken, you know, that Canadian shield, the granite, very creviced, lots of sphagnum moss. I mean, if you watch that documentary, when we go out at one point to plant a camera, I just about broke my ankle. I stepped in a crevice and just about, well, I did go down. They edited it out, but I lost my footing. And so it was treacherous. Except for the portage trails where they've actually established these trails between lakes, it's hard to go cross country there. And so anyway, we had some interesting experiences. The first time we had it was when we had the rock thrown at us, and that was interesting. It was late at night, and we made a habit when we at night to try to stay up late into the wee hours of the morning. I'm not a night person, and so it was always difficult for me. And I'm not a coffee drinker. So it's either Coke or something else to keep me going. But I was starting to get my lids really heavy, and I was afraid I was going to fall asleep and fall into the fire. So I said, hey, I'm going to go in the cabin for a minute and get a drink, splash some water in my face. Went in there. While I'm in there, Dwayne, Doug Hychek's son, Blaine, excuse me, was with us. And the outhouse was about, 75 yards back behind the cabin, down a little catwalk in the pitch black by that time. And he was not about to walk out there by himself. And so he's on the front porch in the shadows a little bit, relieving himself into the bushes there. And all of a sudden, the cabin is sided with corrugated steel siding. And all of a sudden, you heard this ping. It's like someone fired a BB at the side of the cabin. Ping. And I turned and I looked, and with his eyes about this big. You know, he's usually wearing his pants down pretty low anyway, so he didn't have to pull them up very far. But he's hightailing it back over to the campfire. And so I walked out there, and they go, "Did you hear it? Did you hear it?" And I said, "Yes." And I looked at them in the eye. I said, "Which one of you threw the rock?" Oh, well, they were all over there on this side of the cabin. It had come from over here. So Kurt Nelson reaches down. He said, "I'm going to throw a rock back in that direction." And I half jokingly said, "Well, don't throw anything too big. It may come right back at you." And so he had a golf ball sized rock, and he throws it back there, and you hear it bounce off a tree trunk. Nothing happened. So about 5 minutes went by, and then all of a sudden we're kind of standing here, and I happen to be sort of, the cabin's over here, and the fire pit's out here, and the dock's out here. And I'm kind of on the far side, and so I could see the cabin. All of a sudden, a movement caught my eye, and this rock is arcing from back in the direction of the wood pile. Bonk, bonk, bounces across that tin roof, and with really great effect, bang, 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 bang. All of a sudden, the other five, just in unison, as if on some subliminal signal, just like a little line of quail, right into the cabin. I'm going, hey, what are we here for? And Blaine is a city slicker, and if you've ever been camping and the first time a kid gets a hold of an axe, he had been chopping firewood like you wouldn't believe. He thought this was the funnest thing, you know. It even competed his attention for his iPod, and he had piled a whole bunch of wood. The fire pit was a corrugated steel ring that was stuck up at maybe 1.5 feet above the ground level, so it cast a long shadow. And I didn't see it, and I stepped back, and I stepped right on that wood pile, and I went down. Of course, from the cabin, it looked like I'd been hit with another rock. And so, to their credit, they came to my rescue to make sure I was okay. And I go, "What are you guys doing in the cabin?" Oh, we went to get the cameras. Sure you did, yeah. And so, so we went back in to get the equipment. We had a thermal imager with us, and we had a really nice one. I actually had one of the technicians from the company was accompanying it. It was like a $25,000 to $30,000 unit. It was amazing. And of course, I had night vision on my camcorder. And Doug insisted we do a quick interview before we even went outside. He's got to catch the moment. And unfortunately, that's when Kurt made the infamous comment, "Here we are cowering in the cabin." My email box was full of messages. "What in the world are you doing cowering in the cabin?" Now here's what really happened. And Kurt did. I mean, he was the intrepid one who grabbed that thermal imager, and he went charging off into the woods. Of course, you know, whatever it was, had to just stand behind a tree or stand next to a tree if it wanted to avoid contact. I stayed in closer, hoping that he would flush something out into because there was quite a cleared area around the cabin, hoping he would flush something from the tree line, and I could catch it on camera. And but of course we didn't. And so we stayed up around and this is what was funny because it got edited out. We stayed up around the campfire for another hour and a half, and nothing was happening. And I was just, you know, by this time the adrenaline rush had started to dissipate, and I was really getting tired. And I said, "Look, there's nothing's more going to happen. If it does, I'm so tired I wouldn't even be able to interact. So I'm going to go to bed." And they said, "Yeah, okay, but let's keep our clothes on, and we'll be ready to move if anything happens." The lights hadn't been flipped off for 5 minutes when suddenly on the roof of the cabin, kabam, 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 and the lights go on. Blaine was screaming like a little girl. And I said, turn the lights off so we can see out. And I'm looking out the back. It was on the back side that we heard the noise. And there on the stoop was this big chunk of cordwood. Something had lobbed, and all 6 of us are accounted for. And there's no question, we're all there. I mean, if someone was out there pranking us, they had to have been there. We'd already been there for 5 days. No flights in or out for that period of time. No one's going to hike in. No one's going to hang out there for 5 days in the bush, away from the cabin, just to prank us, you know. And so I wasn't quite so eager to run. I was at that point not cowering, but taking refuge under the eaves, because I didn't. If it's raining cordwood, that's different than a golf ball sized rock. And but they edited that out for some reason. I could just I had to laugh. I could just see a couple of Sasquatch out there, and after the lights all went off, someone, you know, the one jabbing the other saying, "Hey, watch this." I'm on. Kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. So, you know, what was it? I don't know. It's kind of a process of elimination, unless bears have sprouted prehensile thumbs that allow them to pick up and lob cordwood, or unless one of these other scenarios was actually the fact that there was someone lurking out there, or someone actually did hike all the way in from somewhere. Then I don't know, but of course we were all primed for that. The second trip, unfortunately, well, then the highlight was the screw board, in some ways. And I had nothing to do with that. Everyone keeps saying that screw board that you put out. Let me make it clear, I did not have anything to do with that. The cabin had been, one of the reasons we were up there is because the cabin had been broken into and ransacked, completely trashed. And of course they thought it could have been a person, but I mean the person would have been psychotic. They tipped over the propane fridge, they broke the bathroom sink off of the wall, they pulled cabinets off of the wall, and yet there were no signs of tools, or you know, there wasn't a machete mark or a hatchet mark or claw hammer mark. There were no claws or teeth marks on the windows or the screens or the door jams. You know, sometimes bears, like Lynn Rogers mentioned in the film, insulation will deteriorate and give off formalin, the smell of formaldehyde, which is similar to formic acid, which smells to a bear like an ant nest. And so they'll tear open the insulation in the refrigerator to thinking they're getting into an ant nest. No signs of any of the typical signature bear activity. But the traditional, in that region, the traditional method to deter bears was to put a nail board or a screw board in front of the door, which is where they usually would, be able to force the door open, break the door jam. And so that was the strategy. So this was laid out. Well, I learned that once we were there, despite the description sounding very promising, this happened 2 years ago, when the screw board had been leaned up against the cabin for 2 years in the sun and in the rain and the snow. And so, you know, the chance of there being any DNA recoverable is really slight. But I thought, oh well, we can talk about it. What if? So as we're sitting there setting up for the interview, and I'm looking at it, and it's kind of interesting because these 2-inch threaded galvanized screws, as you looked, you could see what looked like beef jerky. It was muscle tissue, dried, desiccated muscle tissue in the first part of it, and then down right against the wood was about a 1/2 inch thick to 1 inch thick of this greasy, yellowy looking residue that looked just like fat. And then every here and there were hairs tangled in the screws. So we pulled the hairs off carefully, collected all those. Lynn Rogers examined those and said that they looked like human, but he said they're grown to length and they have a worn tip and they looked like they've never been cut. So he said if I had to identify this, I'd say a wild human. Kind of interesting. As I looked, there were clearly screws that had residue and screws that didn't. And those that didn't, or that did, were in a cluster. So we took the felt tip marker and we just kind of connected the dots and we outlined all those that had residue. And you know, here's the wood, and it outlined a perfect outline of an 18-inch foot with the toes just kind of hanging over the edge. So it had stepped in full weight apparently, because it drove those screws right into the. Presumably, if that scenario, if that interpretation is correct, you can imagine that'd be a pretty debilitating. If you've ever stepped on a nail, that'd be a pretty debilitating injury, especially with those screws, because they didn't slide in and slide out. They went in and reamed a nice 1/8-inch hole. Yeah, I can understand why he's throwing rocks and throwing wood. That's the same one. So we collected whatever tissue we could. There was also what looked like blood, but it was so denatured, so degraded, it almost looked like paint. We weren't sure. It just had a very odd appearance to it. But we collected it, and that was sent to Todd Dissetel at NYU. And he wasn't able to get anything from it. He wasn't able to get the primers to attach to anything. But Kurt is a microbiologist, or a molecular biologist at a lab in Minnesota. He didn't want to leave it, and so he worked at purifying that sample, running it out to gels, cutting it out, eluting it, so on. And then finally got it clean enough that the primers worked, and got only a 300 base sequence, which is just